patria socialista a muerte!
Popular and controversial, Hugo Chavez was Venezuela's most vocal spokesperson and was the West's chief antagonist in the region. Elsewhere, he cultivated cozy ties with countries described as rogue states. But just how will the world remember Hugo Chavez? This is Inside Story. Hello and a very warm welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. We are all Chavez. Those were the chants from his supporters following his death. Venezuela has now declared 7 days of mourning. Losing his 2-year battle with cancer, Chavez died on Tuesday at the age of 58. Always a controversial figure, he rose from the ranks of the military to become the leader of one of Latin America's largest economies. And he divided opinion throughout his presidency, but loved or loathed, Chavez always made an impression. He styled himself as a leader of global anti-imperialism, which was reflected in his international allies. His relations with the United States ranged from strained to outright hostile. They were at their lowest during George W. Bush's presidency, who Chavez famously portrayed as the devil. His strongest regional ally was Bolivia's Evo Morales, who joined Chavez's fight against neoliberalism and imperialism. And his anti-American policy found a natural fit with Iran. Their strong ties were dubbed the Axis of Unity. Chavez was a vocal critic of Israel and severed diplomatic ties following the 2008-2009 Gaza offensive. And despite being well liked by Arab nations, he squandered popular goodwill by backing Bashar al-Assad and Muammar Gaddafi, describing the latter as a martyr following his death. Reaction to his death was as divisive as Chavez himself, with some describing it as a tragedy and others seeing an opportunity for Venezuela to come out of Chavez's shadow. Iran's president called for a day of mourning, describing him as a martyr. He added, "Venezuela lost its brave, strong son, and the world lost a wise and revolutionary leader." Obama said Venezuela was marking a new chapter in its history, affirming his support for the Venezuelan people. And tearful Bolivian President Evo Morales said he was an inspiration, adding that he is now more alive than ever. The British Foreign Secretary William Hague said he was saddened by Chavez's death, saying he had left a lasting impression on the country. Talk more about the implications of the death of Hugo Chavez on the world stage. I'm joined by our guests in London. Jeremy Corbyn, a member of the British Parliament from the opposition Labour Party. Also in London, Natasha Ezrow, lecturer of government at the University of Essex and author of the book Dictators and Dictatorships, Understanding Authoritarian Regimes and Their Leaders. And joining us from Washington, D.C., Raheem Kassam, Executive Editor of the Commentator and Associate Fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. Welcome, all three of you. Thank you very much for joining us. Jeremy, I'm going to start off with you. You met Chavez. I should imagine he's hardly a man you can describe in a nutshell. How do you feel about his death and how do you think he should be remembered?
I feel very sad about his death, and I think he will be remembered as a great figure of Latin America, one that spoke up for the indigenous people and the poor and changed the whole narrative of the politics of the continent towards redistribution of wealth and spending oil resources on people rather than returning it to distant multinational companies. I think he'll be remembered very warmly by a lot of very marginalised and very poor people across the continent. Edward Galeano described the continent very well in his wonderful book, The Open Veins of Latin America. How appropriate that President Chavez gave that as a present to President Obama.
Do your views reflect that of many of the politicians in Britain? I mean, I've been reading some of their comments and they are, if anything, rather bland.
Well, it depends who you speak to, I suppose. On the left of British politics, there's a great deal of warmth and affection towards Chavez and towards Venezuela and what was achieved by the revolution in Venezuela. On the right of British politics, there's less support, but I think they all recognise what an incredible figure he was politically, how he came back against a coup, how he won successive elections, and how sadly has been taken by cancer at the end of his life. But his legacy is one that has asserted Latin American cultural values and asserted Latin America in a way that very few other leaders in the whole continent ever have. I think he'll be remembered perhaps in much the same way as Salvador Allende is remembered, as somebody who stood up against very difficult odds. But actually Chavez lasted much longer, was not defeated, and was finally taken by cancer, not by a coup.
Raheem, I suspect from reading your works that you don't agree with that you believe possibly the world is a better place without him.
Yeah, I think what we need to take stock of here is actually what legacy Hugo Chavez is leaving behind. He's leaving behind industries that have been ruined by his economic policies. Mr. Corbyn's right in saying that many people will miss him, but why will they miss him? It's because here he is a man who nationalised industries, created jobs in that way, which is not real job creation, and actually redistributed wealth in order to gain re-election, effectively bribing people to vote for him. So we have to look at the wider implications of what he achieved as a president. He has chased away any opposition in the country. He has created a press in the country which is stifled, which is nationalised. There is no such thing as a free press in Venezuela, and many people are abused by Chavez's secret police, and hundreds of thousands of people have been disenfranchised and just left out in the cold intentionally. This was not just a man who was doing it because he had bad intentions. What we've seen is also that he actually had mad intentions. The man believed that the moon landing was faked. He didn't believe that bin Laden was a real person. He was a conspiracy theorist of the highest order and a man who befriended tyrants around the world. Nobody should be happy that a man is dead, but we should certainly be excited for the prospect of Venezuelans now having the opportunity to get some real freedom for their country.
But you believe that he could still inflict pain on his people and beyond? I mean, do you agree with Morales that he's more alive now than ever, and is that a concern for you?
That's a massive concern. I think what we need to make sure is that people don't romanticize his legacy. There is always the chance that we can look back on Chavez and only remember him for certain things, such as him getting elected several times in a row. But why did he get elected several times in a row? And what actually were the mechanisms that he used to do it? I have seen documentation that was leaked to me by opposition members that show that if he didn't get re-elected at this last election, he was willing to take Venezuela into martial law, locking down the streets with the army and seizing control in that regard. We know he's no stranger to that, as we saw in the coup in 1992. So there is a real chance that he'll be remembered for something that he was not, and he was not a good man.
Natasha, who do you agree with? I should imagine you miss him in the sense that you've written about him.
Well, it's somewhere in between. I think that there's going to be a lot of people that are going to romanticize his legacy because he was very pro-poor, or at least he tried to speak directly to the poor. He didn't try to speak above them. He seemed like a man of the people. He stood up to the West, at least in sort of his rhetoric. And he wasn't really kleptocratic or overly repressive like some other dictatorships, but really at the end of the day, he wasn't very democratic and he wasn't committed to good governance at all. In fact, corruption rates, which were already pretty bad actually before he took power, have just gotten worse. And if you just look at all the different things, elections, he managed the National Election Commission. He got rid of term limits so that he could basically stay in power indefinitely. And he even said, in effect, that he wanted to stay in power indefinitely. He didn't like political parties. He said he didn't like political parties, and he eradicated public funding for political parties. He completely weakened the legislative branch by eliminating a Senate, replacing it with a 21-person council. He could rule by decree by 2007. He had all kinds of emergency powers. He could hold referendums without any kind of legislative approval. The judicial branch was equally weakened, just
Doesn't sound very democratic, does it?
His supporters. He wasn't very democratic, really, at all, but he did hold elections. They were relatively free of fraud, and he did try to invite more participation from sort of his massive base.
You all touched on very important points, and I'd like to pick my way through them. But Natasha, I'm going to stay with you and focus on your speciality, dictatorships. I mean, he cozied up to so many dictators around the world. Why?
Well, that was all about trying to stand up to the West, which he saw as very imperialistic. And so it was really more for show than really these strong alliances. Ultimately, trade relations with the West didn't really change that much, but this was more symbolic in nature than really anything else.
Jeremy, do you think he let down the Arab world through his alliance with Gaddafi?
I think probably quite a few people in the Arab world were slightly surprised by his alliance with Gaddafi, but he made alliances with a lot of people, I suspect, on a largely pragmatic basis, in the same way as the USA has made alliances with the most ghastly dictators over the past 50 years. But I think the idea that Chavez somehow or other destroyed democracy and justice in Venezuela, I ask two questions. Think what Venezuela was like before Chavez and the abuse of human rights, the marginalization and the poverty of people, and then leap forward and look at the Constitution that was agreed by a referendum, look at the recall referendum which he won, look at the elections which he won, and nobody objected to the election in which he was re-elected last November on the basis that it was anything but a fair summary and a fair reflection of the views of the people of Venezuela.
If he's pro-democracy, though, why would he clamp down on the press? Why would he control the media as much as he did?
Well, how much did he clamp down on the press? Let's be clear about this. The media in Venezuela, if he was a dictator, seemed to survive very well and produce the most virulent criticisms of him that would be libelous in any Western society, yet they carried on doing it and he tolerated it and allowed it to carry on. So if he was a dictator, then he was a very inefficient dictator because he allowed so much opposition to carry on. I think we should think in terms of the work he did in trying to eliminate poverty within his country, the way in which he tried to use the oil revenues across the whole region to improve the lot of people, and use Cuban medical expertise, of course, to assist people in his own country, and of course through ALBA that went on elsewhere. I think the real opposition to Chavez is from the United States, who was so angry at the way in which he built up a credible alternative to the US idea of free trade with Latin America, which in effect is an open sesame for US multinationals to do what they will in the economies of Latin America. Understand, things have changed in Latin America, and I don't think they're going to change back.
And yet, Raheem, the US was his archenemy number one, and yet US remained Venezuela's number one trading partner.
Yeah, which is why, you know, you really must question some of the things that Jeremy raised there. The real question is about Chavez's legacy when it comes to the press is that if he didn't stifle the press so much, then why were there only one or two outlets that were really able to criticize Chavez? One or two outlets that were supported by very rich people. If you wanted to start a Chavez critical outlet from scratch, you could be sure of a knock on your door from Chavez's police. I recently interviewed a man who was charged with holding a Twitter account with several 100,000 followers that was anti-Chavez. It was simply critical of his policies. And the man who was charged with that is now seeking asylum in the United States. His house was raided quite recently in October last year. His family were detained. They stole computers from his house and all sorts of electronic equipment. These are the things that were routine under Chavez's leadership when it comes to the press. I really must ask Jeremy to go back and look at these things case by case and ask himself, really, did Chavez not stifle the press? Many people regard it as a propaganda state, and it was a propaganda state.
Let's pick up, Natasha, on that Twitter comment that you made, Jeremy. I mean, he felt through his mentor, Castro, that he could create a new world order to counter what he described as the greatest evil of all, capitalism. He denounced Twitter, and yet he was a great user of Twitter. Where does that place him?
Well, he's just a man of incredible contradictions. I mean, we already mentioned the contradiction that his rhetoric was just very, very anti-Western, and yet he maintained full trading relations with all the Western countries. And and really not that much had changed. You know, he says he's pro-democracy, but he wants to stay in power indefinitely. So he would say one thing because it gained a lot of attention and it was appealing at the time, and to stand up to capitalism and globalization and all these kinds of things were very appealing, and you know, he had some reasons to do so, some correct reasons to do so. But at the end of the day, he communicated to his audience through the media. I mean, he had weekly chat shows. He's going to use Twitter and all the other forms of social media to communicate directly to his support base.
Jeremy, let's talk about what has been described as a rather contradictory policy when it comes to the Arab world. He describes himself as a man of the people, and yet he stood against Iran's 2009 Green Movement, the Libyan revolution and the Syrian revolution.
Yes, he did. He saw those as counter-revolutionary in terms of the interests of the people of those countries. I think the current chaos that is in Libya needs to be considered in those circumstances. I'm personally not a supporter of Gaddafi, or indeed for that matter of Assad. But the other memory of Chavez across the region is his very uncompromising support for the Palestinian people, and the way in which he encouraged a lot of other Latin American countries to also be strongly in support of the Palestinian people. He was a very important figure worldwide, partly because Venezuela is a very wealthy, potentially very wealthy country with very large mineral reserves, but also because he was prepared to use his position to argue for a different world order. And I think that is the objection that a lot of people, particularly in the United States, had to him. Yes, there were contradictions because the trade with the USA continued, the relations with the USA continued, but he recognized, I think, that power is shifting quite rapidly in the world and wanted to develop closer relations with China. But the idea that he was some kind of crazed dictator trying to stay in power forever, I think is a bit far of the mark. He was elected, and I noticed neither of my colleagues have said too much about the coup that took place against him, which was then overturned in 3 or 4 days by an enormous outpouring of ordinary people on the streets saying that their president was somebody they wanted to keep in office. They didn't want removed by a group of putschists. So I think there is a legacy here of Chavez that we need to recognise, and particularly the empowerment of marginalised and poor people across the whole continent, and that isn't going to change.
Okay, you spoke about the ordinary people, and as you can imagine, we begin a lot of reaction to his death on our Facebook page. Farhan Abu Bakr says Venezuela lost the only man who put them on the map. Whether his critics like it or not, let's see if they find peace now that he has crossed over, as he put it. Say Jahi argues those who will remember him for good are more than others. He was a hero to poor Venezuelans, and they number more than the greedy, rich Venezuelans. Fatma Ahmed says, see how the Americans were so fast to respond. I think they were excited and they couldn't wait for him to die. Zinobi Dar says, I definitely won't be missing a dictator who before his death was worth $2 billion US dollars, while many of his citizens wallowed in abject poverty and squalor. Natasha, do you foresee a better relationship now with the US? Possibility of that?
Yeah, I do, because the rhetoric was somewhat damaging to the relationship, even though the trading relationship really didn't change that much. His successor that he appointed, Nicolas Maduro, who was his vice president and is more of a sort of soft-spoken person, has more of a calm demeanor, is probably unlikely to have the same kind of charismatic appeal and use sort of these impassioned speeches to attack the West. And so I can only imagine that the relationship will probably improve and will probably maintain the same types of trading relations that they had in the past.
And where does this leave Raheem, Latin America? He was such a spokesperson for them, especially for the leftists. Might we see a shift to the centre?
Well, I'm not quite sure about that, but I think where it leaves them is with the opportunity to show that they actually don't need someone like Chavez to be their main trumpeter. There are plenty of opposition leaders across Latin America who have very strong voices. There are plenty of people in Venezuela, in fact, as we know, who will be willing now to come out and speak their minds more without having necessarily have the threat of Chavez's police to try and shut them down. But I think it's important that we pick up on one of the points that Jeremy made about the New World Order that Chavez was looking to create. If we are really to judge what he intended for his people, and indeed what he intended for the world, on the alliances that he made around the world, it's important to remember that he wasn't necessarily a big spokesperson or helper of the Palestinian people, for instance. He was a supporter of the state of Iran. He was a supporter of the state of Iran under the Ahmadinejad regime. And if we look at how the Ahmadinejad regime has sought to empower the Palestinian people, it's often by putting them in the firing line. And I just don't think that someone like Hugo Chavez was making a calculation based on other people's well-being. He was making a calculation based on what he believed was Western imperialism. And I think that that should be rejected. That idea should be rejected across the board.
Jeremy, your response to that?
Well, I'm quite used to the idea that the Henry Jackson Society can never see a good motive in anyone who disagrees with them. That's par for the course with them. Chavez supported the Palestinian people. That helped to get that very strong Latin American vote for Palestinian recognition. That recognition is surely a step towards peace in the long run for that region, but we're a long way off peace in the whole region. Chavez spoke up for people, and people around the world recognized that if they were marginalized, poor and dispossessed and trying to get their fair share of the cake, then Chavez was somebody that was on their side. They didn't necessarily see everybody else as being on their side, and that it really is not such a bad legacy to have, and I think history will be very kind to Chavez for the changes he brought in Venezuela and the changes he brought in Latin America, and having visited many countries in Latin America and seen the inspiration of people whose language, non-Spanish speakers, were so marginalized in the past, and that whole history, and particularly his embracing of Bolivar's vision for Latin America, is something that will endure.
Natasha, I should imagine that somebody who's such a big personality, people are either going to love them or hate them, but regardless of what you feel about him, where do you think Venezuela will be? What sort of direction will they take now? Will we see more peace, possibly more democracy in the region?
Well, I hope so. I hope that the new regime will try to eradicate some of the mistakes of the past, which was by making, personalizing power more or less in Chavez's hands directly. I mean, there's a third way here. You can be pro-poor. You can focus on improving the lives of the poor without having to stick to dictatorial tactics. And I'm hoping that that's the direction that they move in and try to model themselves more after some of the other regimes in Latin America that have been center-left, that have focused on not only improving the poor's life by giving them handouts, by creating actually coherent developmental policies that can help them lift themselves out of poverty in a way that doesn't also support just tremendous corruption that's really, really hurt the regime. So there's an opening here. I'm not as tough on his legacy as maybe some, in that I think that it was important for him to bring and shed light onto the issues of the poor. Previous regimes did not care about the poor at all. And so that's one of his important legacies. But at the end of the day, I mean, he's leaving a regime that's very corrupt.
Talking about Hugo Chavez, who has died at the age of 58. Thanks all to my guests, Jeremy Corbyn, Natasha Ezrow, Raheem Kassam, and thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, email your thoughts to insidestory@aljazeera.net or send comments to our Facebook page, facebook.com/Al Jazeera. And we leave you with some of Chavez's most memorable moments. Thanks again for watching. Goodbye for now.
The devil is here at home. The devil came here yesterday. In this very spot, it still smells like sulfur. Since she messed with me again, here's a kiss, Condoleezza. Have a kiss, Condoleezza. Have a kiss and forgive me for that. But remember, little girl, I'm like the thorn tree that flowers on the plain. I waft my scent to passers-by and prick he who shakes me. Don't mess with me, Condoleezza. Don't mess with me, girl.
Su propia salsa. Soy mal querido por Hillary Clinton. yo tampoco la quiero. La ra 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 ra, la ra 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 ra, ra 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 ra.